Postcolonialism is all about understanding the impact of the colonial encounter between the West and the non-West, starting from the 16th century and continuing to today. It's not just about studying history, it's about exploring how this encounter has shaped the lives of everyone involved, both the colonizers and the colonized. What's really important here is that postcolonialism isn't just an academic field. It's also a form of political action, a way of resisting unjust authority and challenging oppressive systems. You'll see that it considers a wide range of responses to colonization, from subtle protests, things that might go unnoticed, to outright rebellion and open defiance. So, at its core, postcolonialism is about understanding these different ways people respond and resist, and it's closely connected to the broader theme of challenging power structures and seeking justice. It's a vital perspective for understanding how histories of colonization continue to influence our world today. Let's talk about the debate among critics regarding the use of the hyphen in the term postcolonial. Some argue that including the hyphen is important because it often refers to a specific chronological period that follows independence, like after 1947. On the other hand, when we write it as postcolonial without the hyphen, it tends to refer more broadly to responses, like liberatory or oppositional movements, that challenge colonial legacies across all time periods. However, there's a concern that using the hyphen or even the term itself might imply that these cultures are defined solely by their colonial experience. This raises an important question about whether the term might inadvertently limit how we understand these societies and their identities. So this debate, the postcolonial hyphen debate, really gets at how language shapes our understanding of history, identity, and resistance. It connects directly to our overall theme of exploring how postcolonial identities are constructed and expressed, and whether the language we use helps or hinders that understanding. Postcolonialism is best understood as a theoretical creole, which means it's highly mixed and draws from a wide variety of histories and political ideas. It's not rooted in a single tradition, but instead combines elements from different sources. The key concepts that shape postcolonial theory come from both anti-colonial politics, those struggles to resist and overthrow colonial powers, and from global movements fighting for rights and equity worldwide. What's really interesting is that postcolonialism incorporates three main genealogies or intellectual lineages. First, there are the national liberation struggles. Think of the fight for independence and self-determination in many former colonies. Second, it's influenced by French post-structuralism, which challenges fixed meanings and emphasizes the fluidity of identity and power structures. And third, it draws from third world literatures, which give voice to those marginalized voices in post-colonial contexts. This mixedness, or diversity of sources, is actually why you often see different thinkers within post-colonial theory disagree or have varying perspectives. There's no single, unified voice, because it's a rich tapestry of ideas coming from different historical and cultural backgrounds. So, in essence, postcolonialism is like a creole, something that's shaped by many influences, making it a dynamic and sometimes complex field of thought that reflects the diverse realities of post-colonial societies. This diversity is what makes it so relevant to understanding the ongoing struggles for identity, rights, and sovereignty today. The foundation of postcolonialism really starts with the independence struggles that took place in the first half of the 20th century. Countries like India, Egypt, Algeria, and Kenya all played significant roles in shaping this movement. Early on, groups such as the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially aimed for simple goals like assimilation and self-representation within the colonial system. They wanted to have a voice, to be recognized, but not necessarily to completely break away. However, when colonial authorities refused to dismantle social and economic hierarchies that kept certain groups privileged and others oppressed, these movements began to shift. Frustration grew, and they moved toward more confrontational approaches. The goal transformed from seeking just a voice to demanding full independence, like the concept of Purna Swaraj in India, which means complete self-rule. So these early movements laid the groundwork for anti-colonial nationalism, and their evolution highlights how the desire for independence grew stronger as colonial powers resisted change. This history is crucial because it shows the roots of post-colonial thought and the fight to reclaim sovereignty. Let's talk about Frantz Fanon, who was not only a psychiatrist but also an activist. He really pioneered the study of what he called the colonization of the psyche. In other words, he looked at how colonial oppression affects the mind and the feelings of those who are colonized. He analyzed what he called the arsenal of complexes, which include feelings like inferiority and social invisibility, things that are deeply rooted in the experience of colonial domination. Fanon argued that colonialism isn't just about land or resources. It operates on two levels. There's the objective, material level, things like land, resources, and political power. And then there's the subjective, psychological level, which influences how people see themselves and others. Both these levels are interconnected and reinforce each other, making colonialism a complex and pervasive force. For Fanon, resistance isn't something that starts after colonization is established. It begins the moment Europeans set out to dominate native peoples. Resistance is almost built into the process itself. Understanding this helps us see that combating colonial mentalities is just as crucial as fighting physical oppression. So, when we consider Fanon's ideas, we see how deeply colonialism affects not just societies but individual psyches, and how fighting back requires addressing both these layers, material and psychological. This insight is vital as we explore the broader impacts of colonization and the ongoing struggles for liberation. Let's walk through Fanon's tripartite schema of resistance, which is a really influential framework in understanding post-colonial activism. First, we have stage 1, assimilation. This is where the colonized elite tries to adopt the culture and values of the colonizer. It's like they're attempting to fit into the colonizer's world, often at the expense of their own identity. Next comes stage 2, disturbance. Here, there's a shift, a move toward reclaiming local cultural traditions. It's about reconstituting a sense of identity that may have been suppressed or distorted during colonization. Finally, stage 3, the fighting phase. This is where the native intellectual actively shakes the people, rallying them to resist. They work to retrieve a damaged selfhood and challenge the colonial power through active resistance. This whole panorama highlights how resistance evolves, from initial adaptation to cultural disturbance, all the way to active rebellion. And it's worth noting that this schema has been highly influential, especially in how critics like Edward Said understand the progression of post-colonial activism. It really helps us see the stages of how colonized societies respond and resist colonization, shaping their path toward decolonization and cultural sovereignty. Anti-colonial struggle is often understood as a Manichaean or binary conflict. That means it's seen as a simple us versus them, a self versus other kind of battle. The colonial self, which is seen as rational and superior, is defined in direct opposition to the perceived barbarism of the native other. This creates a deeply polarized view of identity, where one side is seen as civilized and the other as uncivilized. Now, thinkers like Fanon and the Negritude group argued that this binary system must be completely dismantled. It's not enough to just flip the script or invert the opposition. Instead, they believed it was necessary to completely destroy this binary way of thinking. What they advocated for was a redefinition by the colonized peoples themselves. They needed to remake their identities on their own terms. This meant Indianizing, Africanizing, or Caribbeanizing their identities, taking control of their self-definition rather than accepting the imposed colonial narrative. This idea ties into the overall theme of decolonization, moving away from the Manichaean structure of empire, which simplifies complex identities into two opposing sides. Instead, it's about creating new, authentic identities rooted in the colonized people's own cultures and histories. Fanon's most controversial contribution is his argument for revolutionary violence as a means of opposition. He believed that exercising oppositional violence allows the colonized, who are often seen as a nonentity, to become active creators of their own future. For Fanon, this act of cathartic violence, where the colonizer is ejected, serves as a crucial part of the psychological healing process. It's about breaking free from the psychological chains imposed by colonial powers. This idea stands in stark contrast to the approach championed by Mohandas Gandhi, who emphasized nonviolence and passive resistance. Fanon's perspective is more radical, emphasizing the need for active, sometimes violent, resistance to truly reclaim agency. So, when we talk about revolutionary violence and agency, it's about understanding how violence, in Fanon's view, can be a tool for liberation, helping the oppressed to assert their power and reshape their future. It's a provocative but vital concept when exploring the different paths to decolonization and liberation. So, in 1978, Edward Said published Orientalism, and this work really marked a turning point in how we understand postcolonial studies. It wasn't just a book, it essentially established the field itself. Said took Mitchell Foucault's ideas about power and knowledge and applied them directly to the realities of colonization. What he argued is that the so-called Orient isn't just a natural or fixed place. Instead, it's an imaginative geography, a construct created by Western scholars and thinkers. This means that the way the West has depicted the East isn't based on objective reality, but on representations that served specific cultural and political purposes. Said examined how these constructions of the other, the way the West portrayed and understood the East, helped maintain Western dominance across cultural and political spheres. This idea of Orientalism is powerful because it shows how knowledge and power are intertwined, and how perceptions shape realities, especially in the context of colonialism. Overall, this slide highlights how these representations are not innocent or neutral, but are deeply connected to maintaining certain power structures. So, here we see that Orientalism served as a Western framework for asserting dominance over the Orient. It wasn't just about understanding or studying these regions. It was about reshaping and controlling them. The West exercised authority by categorizing native peoples through censuses, laws, and anthropological research, often portraying them as inferior or incapable of self-rule. This approach relied heavily on a stark division. On one side, the dominant, colonizing West, and on the other, what we might call the underground selves, or the subjugated peoples. This creates a systematic discourse, something that shapes how we see and understand other cultures from the outside, often without truly engaging with their own perspectives. It's a way of controlling and defining them by external standards. Furthermore, Orientalism isn't just a set of ideas in isolation. It functions as a corporate institution. That means it's embedded within systems, legal, academic, political, that perpetuate this framing. Overall, this slide highlights how Orientalism was fundamentally about establishing and maintaining Western authority through a constructed and systemic narrative about the Orient. When Said talks about the worldliness of texts, he's emphasizing something really important. That literature isn't this detached, abstract thing floating in some nebulous space. Instead, he argues that texts are deeply connected to the real world. They are shaped by and, in turn, influence concepts like authority, power, and even the imposition of force. So, when we analyze a piece of literature, we can't ignore its social and political context, because those elements are embedded in the text itself. He also makes a crucial point about critics and scholars. A major critic, he says, must always write from within their own present time and context. You can't step outside your era and fully grasp a text without your own biases and perspectives creeping in. This means that trying to completely divorce a text from the reality it was created in is ultimately impossible. It's doomed to fail. So, the worldliness of a text reminds us that literature is always part of a larger social fabric. It's not just about individual expression, but about how texts operate within and are influenced by the real, powerful forces in society. This aligns with the overall theme of understanding literature as something inherently connected to the world around us. So, here we see that Said developed this idea of contrapuntal reading, as a way to find resistance within the very texts of empire itself. What this means is that, when we read these works, we're not just accepting the dominant narrative at face value. Instead, we're simultaneously aware of the official, or dominating, history, and also the resistant histories that are present beneath or alongside it. This approach encourages us to read against the grain, so to speak, to uncover the struggles over meaning that are happening within European novels. Critics who adopt this method look for these hidden or suppressed voices that challenge the official story. For example, with Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a typical reading might focus on its imperial critique. But a contrapuntal reading pushes us to see how the novel unsettles its official imperial narrative by highlighting the non-Western worlds and perspectives that it often marginalizes. So, in essence, contrapuntal reading helps us understand how texts can contain multiple voices, some supporting the dominant ideology, others resisting or complicating it. This method really ties into the broader theme of how literature can serve as a site of resistance within the structures of empire. So, here's an interesting aspect of postcolonial writing. These writers often find ways to answer the colonial oppressor back by using the oppressor's own tools. That means they take the forms, styles, and symbols, what we can call the cultural vocabulary, of the dominant European texts and myths. What's really clever about this is how they appropriate these elements. Instead of just copying, they adapt and manipulate these myths in subversive ways. This allows them to ridicule and refute how they've been portrayed, turning these familiar tools into a form of resistance. By doing this, they're exercising political agency. They're not just creating stories, they're using texts as powerful tools to change hearts and minds. Essentially, they're reclaiming their narratives and challenging the colonial narratives imposed on them. This process of appropriating the cultural vocabulary is central to understanding how postcolonial writers undermine colonial authority and assert their own identities and voices. It's a strategic, creative way to rewrite the story on their terms, connecting deeply to the broader theme of resistance and empowerment in postcolonial literature. Let's take a closer look at what Gayatri Spivak argued here. She challenged the idea that colonial oppression is a single, unified force. Instead, she emphasized the heterogeneity, or the profound differences, among those labeled as the colonized. This means that we shouldn't think of colonized peoples as a monolith, but recognize the variety of experiences and identities within them. Spivak used deconstruction to identify points of rupture and contradiction in colonial representations. This approach helps us see where dominant narratives break down or reveal inconsistencies. She also insisted on paying attention to the specific gendered aspects of colonial experience. These nuances are often overlooked by masculinist theories that tend to generalize or ignore gender differences. So overall, this slide highlights the importance of understanding colonial oppression as diverse and complex, emphasizing the need to consider gendered and individual differences in our analysis. This connects to our broader theme of challenging simplified narratives and recognizing multiple layers of experience. Let's start with the term subaltern. It refers to social groups that are not part of the elite or ruling classes, like peasants or those who don't even appear on the social map at all. Essentially, these are groups that are marginalized or unheard within the dominant social structures. In her famous essay, Gayatri Spivak pointed out an interesting paradox. She argued that researchers who try to give voice to these subaltern groups often end up silencing them. How does that happen? Well, she suggests that what we call subaltern consciousness isn't simply a natural or authentic voice waiting to be heard. Instead, it's a constructed idea, shaped by socially accepted language and power relations. This means that the subaltern cannot just speak freely. Their voice is mediated and constrained by the very language and discourse that define what is considered legitimate speech. They have no real space within the dominant discourse to be heard authentically. Their silence isn't just about lack of voice, but about a structural absence of space for their authentic voice to emerge. So the question, can the subaltern speak, challenges us to think about whether true voice is even possible within these constraints. It pushes us to consider the ways in which power, language, and social structures shape who can speak and who remains unheard. This idea ties into our overall theme of understanding power dynamics and representation in society. Let's talk about Spivak's concept of epistemic violence, which is really about how imperialism destroys native ways of knowing and being. She points out that this isn't just physical domination, but also a suppression of different knowledge systems and cultural identities. She also analyzed how classic texts like Jane Eyre depend on the presence of a marginalized other, like Bertha Mason, to help construct the white feminist heroine. Essentially, Bertha's role highlights how the narrative relies on silencing or marginalizing certain voices to define the dominant one. Bertha symbolizes the subaltern, those whose voices are often unheard or suppressed. Interestingly, she must kill herself so the Western individualist hero can succeed. This reflects a broader pattern where the subaltern's existence is erased to uphold certain dominant narratives. For postcolonial criticism, according to Spivak, the focus should be on how representational systems, the ways stories and identities are constructed, silence marginalized groups, especially women subalterns, from the start. It's about unpacking the underlying systems that make such silencing possible. So, in essence, epistemic violence isn't just about physical harm. It's about the systematic silencing and erasure of knowledge and identities that challenge imperialist and colonial power structures. Today, I want to talk about Spivak's idea of strategic essentialism. Essentially, this is about the savvy use of a fixed identity, like woman, to reach specific political goals. But it's important to understand that this isn't about believing in some inherent, natural essence of that identity. Instead, it's about asserting that identity in a clear and visible way to serve a particular interest. This approach allows groups to make practical, negotiated interventions when facing unjust domination. It's a strategic tool, not a declaration of some unchanging truth. Think of it as a temporary stage in the ongoing process of decolonization, something that helps us move forward, even if it's not the final answer. So, strategic essentialism is about using identity as a strategic, flexible instrument, an important concept in understanding how marginalized groups can navigate and challenge power structures effectively. So, Homi Bhabha proposed an interesting idea about the colonial system. He suggested that it's not a simple, stable binary, like colonizer versus colonized, but rather something more complex, filled with ambivalence. What this means is that the identity of the colonizer isn't entirely solid or clear-cut. It exists in a kind of uneasy relationship with the colonized. There's a tension there, a sort of ongoing negotiation. This tension reveals that the system isn't perfectly black and white. Instead, it's riddled with cultural fault lines. These are like cracks or divisions that undermine any straightforward distinctions between oppressor and oppressed. Because of this ambivalence, these fissures can be exploited by the colonized. They can use these cracks to voice their own desires, challenge the system, and push back against imposed identities. This concept of colonial ambivalence ties into our larger theme of how power and identity are more fluid and complex than they often seem. It shows us that colonial systems are not static, but are constantly shaped and reshaped by these underlying tensions and contradictions. Mimicry was essentially the colonial project of trying to domesticate native populations by encouraging them to imitate European social structures. The idea was that if the colonized could adopt European ways, they would be easier to control. But what this actually produced was a kind of colonial subject who was almost the same but not quite. They looked similar on the surface, but they were not fully aligned, especially when it came to race, since they were almost the same but not white. This imperfect repetition is really important because it signals the strategic failure of the colonial project to establish total authority. The colonizers wanted to create a complete, unquestioning copy of their social order, but that didn't fully happen. Instead, mimicry often shifted into mockery, which shows that the colonizers' power was never entirely secure. So mimicry becomes a kind of double-edged sword. It's about imitation, but it can also expose the cracks in colonial power. And that's why we say mimicry is almost the same, but not quite. It highlights the ongoing tension in colonial relationships, where power is never completely stable or absolute. Hybridity occurs when, denied, knowledges enter dominant discourse and estrange its basis of authority. What this means is that marginalized or suppressed ways of knowing can challenge and disrupt the established power structures. It often marks moments of spectacular resistance or civil disobedience within the system, where those on the margins actively push back against dominant narratives. Babha proposed the idea of the third space of enunciation, which is a kind of liminal zone where elements of different cultures are rearticulated and translated. This space is not fixed or static. It's creative and malleable, allowing for the negotiation of new meanings and identities. So, when we think about hybridity and the third space, we're looking at how cultural interactions can produce new, hybrid identities that challenge traditional boundaries. This concept fits into our overall theme by showing how cultures are not static, but constantly evolving through these moments of resistance and negotiation. It's a powerful way to understand cultural change and the ongoing dialogue between different ways of knowing and being. Literature has historically been used by empires as a way to demonstrate their cultural superiority. For example, in 1835, Thomas Macaulay famously claimed that just a single shelf of European literature was worth more than all the native writings produced in India. This kind of statement reflects how European social worlds were seen as more elevated and advanced, compared to what was considered the uncouth, colonial periphery. Colonial education systems often focused on European texts, reinforcing the idea that European culture and knowledge were superior. Overall, this use of literature as an index of cultural superiority was a powerful tool to justify colonial dominance and maintain the hierarchy between the colonizers and the colonized. Postcolonial writers often appropriate and reassemble aspects of the colonizing culture, such as languages, ceremonies, and other cultural elements. They don't just copy these elements. Instead, they rework them in ways that challenge or transform their original meanings. They misread canonical writers like Shakespeare or Bronte, meaning they interpret these texts through a different lens to create new, culturally resonant works. For example, Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea reimagines the character of the madwoman from Jane Eyre, but from a Caribbean perspective, giving voice to a different cultural experience. What's really interesting is how these writers define themselves from within the colonists' language. They take European texts, often seen as dominant or authoritative, and slant or reshape them to fit their own frameworks and realities. This process of appropriation and writing back is a powerful way for post-colonial writers to challenge the original narratives and produce new, transformative stories that speak from their own contexts. It's about reclaiming agency within the colonizers' words and rewriting the cultural landscape. Self-definition through narrative has been of crucial importance for most post-colonial writers. It's a way for them to shape and express their identity, often by telling stories that reflect their history, culture, and struggles. When we talk about national literature, it's not just about individual stories, it's about creating a shared sense of identity and purpose. These works often blend mythic and oral traditions, drawing from local stories and cultural practices to forge a collective national destiny, especially after gaining independence. Writers play a vital role here. They often expose the absurdity of colonial values, like valuing English flowers such as daffodils over locally cherished jasmine. This critique highlights how colonial powers tried to impose their culture, often dismissing indigenous traditions. And this is where narrative becomes a fundamental tool. It's not just storytelling, but a way to build and reinforce a sense of nationhood. Through stories, a country can define itself, remember its roots, and imagine its future. So ultimately, narrative and nation building are deeply interconnected. Storytelling helps create a shared identity that sustains the nation's independence and pride. So, one important point to understand is that post-colonial nations often inherited the structures of authority established by their colonial rulers. This means that many of the political institutions and governance systems remained largely unchanged, which sometimes made it difficult for these new nations to fully redefine their identity or address local needs. Another key issue was how European-drawn borders often grouped together culturally diverse groups that might not have shared a common history or identity. These borders forced different communities to live together as one nation, which could create tensions and challenges for national unity. We also see that after independence, a new elite, sometimes described as a kleptocratic black bourgeoisie, took over from the white colonial ruling class. This means that a small group of local elites often gained control of power and resources, sometimes engaging in corruption and maintaining their dominance at the expense of broader society. All of this contributed to the idea of the aberrant postcolony, where a nation might be politically independent on paper but still face significant restrictions, whether economic, political, or social, that limited genuine sovereignty and development. In the big picture, these points highlight how post-colonial nations faced unique and complex challenges in establishing true independence, especially when the inherited structures and borders did not necessarily align with local realities or aspirations. Let's delve into the concept of neocolonialism, a term that Kwame Nkrumah famously used to describe this new form of dominance. He argued that, in many cases, countries gained independence on paper but were still controlled through economic means, such as debt and trade dependencies. Ngugi wa Thiong'o referred to this situation as flag independence, highlighting that even though nations hoisted their flags and gained formal sovereignty, they remained deeply indebted to Western powers. This economic dependency often meant that true independence was more superficial than real. Arundhati Roy added another layer to this understanding, pointing out that while many countries officially became independent, the old colonial structures and inequalities often persisted. Independence, in many cases, was just a ceremonial act that reinforced existing hierarchies rather than dismantling them. And here's the critical point. This situation left many nations with what I call a wooden loaf instead of the promised food and freedom. They appeared to have achieved independence, but in reality, they were still trapped in a cycle of economic dependency and unequal power relationships. So, when we talk about neocolonialism as a charade, we're questioning whether the independence really meant liberation or simply a new form of control masquerading as freedom. It's a reminder to look beyond surface appearances and question who truly benefits from these so-called independent states. Women in post-colonial nations faced a complex challenge, often described as double colonization by both patriarchy and colonialism. This means they were marginalized not only because of their gender, but also due to the lingering effects of colonial rule. Many nationalist leaders, who were mostly men, tended to position women as custodians of tradition. While this might seem like a way to honor cultural values, it often resulted in women being excluded from full citizenship and political participation. Women seeking self-determination and equality frequently encountered obstacles, especially because European perceptions at the time favored male leadership and authority. These perceptions reinforced gender roles that kept women from asserting their rights fully. However, it's important to recognize that only in recent years have grassroots organizations involving women started to emerge as powerful voices. These groups are now officially asserting themselves and playing a crucial role in shaping post-colonial societies. This idea of double colonization highlights a key theme of our presentation: how the legacies of colonialism and patriarchy continue to influence the struggle for independence, equality, and national identity. The acceleration of global migration has led to what we now call permanently shifting ethnoscapes, or landscapes of ethnicity and identity across the world. This ongoing movement has really highlighted how race, nation, and ethnicity are not fixed or purely biological categories, but rather social constructs, imaginary in many ways. Modern identities are becoming more liminal and hybrid, meaning they don't fit neatly into traditional boxes anymore. Instead, they circulate across borders through commodities, technology, and cultural exchanges. This fluidity challenges the old notions of fixed national or racial identities. Postcolonial theory plays a crucial role here by seeking to dislodge the monoculturalist norms that have historically dominated Western education, encouraging us to see these identities as complex and constructed rather than fixed or essential. All of this ties back to our overall theme of understanding how identities evolve and are reshaped in a globalized, interconnected world. Let's talk about some of the critiques of the so-called Holy Trinity, said Spivak and Babha. Critics like Ajaz Ahmed have raised questions about their legacy and influence. They argue that these theorists are primarily well-established Western academics who have built careers by theorizing about oppression. What's interesting is that their work often references Western philosophical canons, such as post-structuralism, which some see as limiting or biased. Critics also point out that their focus on discursive resistance, meaning resistance through language and ideas, can sometimes overshadow more practical material forms of political activism. In essence, these critiques challenge whether this theoretical approach adequately addresses real-world struggles, especially when it emphasizes discourse over concrete action. This debate ties into our broader theme of understanding different methods of resistance and the impact of Western academic frameworks on post-colonial thought. So, the main goal of postcolonialism is really about provincializing the West. What does that mean? Well, it's about challenging the tendency to see Europe and North America as the center of the world, marginalizing other regions and their histories. Instead, postcolonialism aims to give voice back to the peoples and cultures from the non-European world that have often been silenced or overlooked. Even though postcolonial studies are becoming more common in academia, its political agenda remains urgent. It's not just about theory, it's about actively fighting for social justice across the globe. And that includes addressing the ways in which Western institutions, like our classrooms, can sometimes perpetuate neocolonial attitudes, subtly continuing the marginalization of others. So, when we talk about provincializing the West, we're really talking about a crucial shift in perspective. It asks us to rethink our assumptions and recognize that justice should be universal. Postcolonialism challenges us to confront inequalities everywhere, whether in distant colonies or right here in our educational spaces. It's a call to expand our understanding and to promote equity wherever it's needed most.